Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary, where I am extremely excited about what today's project means for future projects. So, if you enjoy what you're about to see, remember to leave a like, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. Now let's just jump right into the project so we can explain things as we go. The game is a 2D underwater action game where the player controls a diver of sorts. Now, instead of moving around in any direction like we normally do for an action game, to make things interesting, the player can only move in one direction at a time. Doing so will propel them forward with each subsequent key press, adding to the momentum in whatever direction that they desire. To an extent, of course. Can't have the player zipping around like a torpedo. And actually, speaking of, the player can also fire projectiles, but again, to make things interesting, the control is limited to just firing horizontally. And finally, there is the player's special ability, which can be activated with spacebar. Now, each level is broken down into several rooms. When the level begins, the amount of rooms generated is based on a variable. Each generated room is recorded to a list, and each room also generates its own list of enemies and where to spawn them within the room, along with a variable for whether or not the room has been cleared, which means each room needs to be cleared in order for the player to advance. However, if the player feels overwhelmed or is driven by some other motivation, they can actually teleport back to their previous combat encounter with spacebar. This will allow the player to redo the previous room, but with a twist. All the enemies are re-rolled. If the player clears the room, they are given the ability to teleport again. And this system was actually both really cool to figure out, and it was a bit of a nightmare to implement. Now, the original execution was a lot more math heavy, but surprise surprise, doing so came with unexpected issues due to, you guessed it, bad math. So instead, the game literally keeps track of the player's position at all times. So once a change is detected in which room the player is currently in, this assumes they've either teleported or moved on. It's not as elegant as hoped, but it got the job done. Kind of like, okay, I've got nothing. Look, if you enjoy these videos, supporting me on Patreon is the best way to help me keep making them, and doing so can get you access to exclusive content and downloads, and even early access to the weekly Dev Diary videos before they're released on YouTube. Now, our roster of enemies are a pretty fun and diverse cast of underwater wildlife. Our first is a little orange friend that'll follow the player around and try to give them some nibbles. Nibbles hurt, but fish gotta eat. Our next fish is, I guess, an angler fish, capable of spitting bullets like a gunfish. They're only able to fire right and left, so they're empathetic to the player's plight. Similarly, the angelfish-looking fish can only fire left and right, but they also cheat a little by having their projectiles slightly hone in on the player's position. Now, this green fish has mastered the art of underwater projectiles with the ability to lob their projectiles like some sort of stone or heavy bubble of doom, completely mixing up the game for our fish thus far in terms of expectations. Speaking of which, our next enemy isn't even a fish. Or maybe it is. It's purple and it too fires projectiles. But two differences. One, this enemy cannot move and will slowly sink to as far down as possible, but being immobile means little considering that B, they can fire a projectile in any direction that they want, which is usually directly at the player. Our fifth enemy is a blast from the past. It's a squid/octopus-like creature and, much like the squid from Mario, will occasionally thrust themselves in the direction of the player, attempting to headbutt them in the process. And our final enemy is one that is only concerned with swimming from left to right. However, getting too close will trigger this easily frightened yellow fiend, causing it to burst, creating a flower pattern of evil projectiles in the process. Definitely want to avoid if at all possible. And funny story, while majority of this code works well, the spawning code would sometimes put an enemy in a wall, even with the checks that are meant to prevent this from happening. So enemies had to have an extra check added to their code to literally push them out of walls should they spawn in one. I hope to find a better solution to this in the future, but for now, brute force seems to be working. And really, that was kind of the project. However, in order to cover what I'm most excited for in this one, we need to rewind a bit. And if you've been here a while, you may have already picked up on it. It's the level generation. This is the first step in the evolution of a level generation system that I've been working on that takes doodles and transforms them into playable levels. The plan is to not only improve the system, but also make it more versatile. So today's project was a test of that versatility by breaking down each possible generation into edges. In other words, each room is made up of 4 different doodles that have been converted using the level generation system. Then, using some math, we determined which walls are needed for each room to build one long single connected path throughout. Now again, this is totally a multi-step process, and this project was just the first step, so the setup was simplified to 5 rooms per row, with the amount of rows determined randomly per level. And while I was able to get this working as I'd hoped, there is still an issue of proper pathways. For now, I simply used some math to guarantee that necessary walls were destroyed, which is why sometimes the vertical transitions include floating rocks between rooms. It also explains why the generation isn't too crazy, because the fish also kept getting stuck in the more elaborate designs. So in other words, I've learned that this system can be broken down into even more specific values, meaning things are about to get a lot more interesting for this system in the near future. Now, I know this sort of overshadowed the rest of the project, so what did you think of that teleportation idea? Is there anything other than perhaps healing that we could add to motivate the player to use the feature more? I feel like there might be something to it, but I just don't know if the idea can be expanded enough to make it interesting, you know, like a main mechanic. Anyway, leave any and all thoughts in the comments. And with that said, brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.